What we're going to do now is look at the oscillators on the Jupiter 8V. And there they are right there, VCO1, VCO2. Now what we're going to do is look at this section. I'll draw now. We've got from this PWM control, pulse width modulation, from there across, go through the two VCOs and over here to the VCO mixer. Okay, this is the sound creation section of the Jupiter. This is where all the noises is going to come from, is this small selection of controls here. So VCO, in case you don't know, stands for voltage controlled oscillator. The early synths obviously used the what was called the CV and gate standard, where they used voltage to control pitch. And the VCO essentially sounded a little, what's considered to be these days richer and more warm and analog than its later counterpart, the DCO, the digitally controlled oscillator. And then after that we actually have software and code, and we're starting to move a long way away from kind of hot components, variable tolerances that don't really behave every time exactly the same way. And that's kind of the charm of the original analog synthesizers, this slight variation depending on the heat of the room, the heat of the synth, whether the guy put the right amount of solder on that day compared to the next chip, and so on and so on. Now Arturia have modelled in their whole range of analog synthesizers the behaviour of this sort of analog aspect of these synthesizers. So they're attempting to recreate the sound of a VCO, which is, it's just noticeably different to a digital synth, as you'll notice when we start playing with them. Okay, so we have simply on the Jupiter 8, there are two oscillators per voice, VCO1, VCO2. This means there were 16 oscillators across the whole synth, and that gave you the 8 voices of the Jupiter 8. They're quite well spec'd. No, it's not fair. They're very well spec'd. The reason the Jupiter 8 was so successful at the time it was launched was that it was a real workhorse synthesizer. It covered an awful lot of different sonic territories with a minimum of controls, really, which has always been one of Roland's strongest points of their synthesizers. They tend to be somehow pared back so that there's not too much to confuse you when you're confronted with one. But the actual sort of range of possibilities they contain is deceptively large. So what do we actually have in these VCO sections? Okay, well straight away we've got the obvious simple controls of pitch, which is shown here as range, waveform, where we select shape of the oscillator's wave. Then we have, again, over on VCO2, range, and this time we have fine tune, where we can change in steps of less than a whole note, a whole semitone. We can actually do fine variations in the pitch of the oscillator 2 compared to oscillator 1. And again, we have the waveform selector. Now we also have these two other things. We have, over on VCO1, we have a thing called cross, and on VCO2 we have a thing called sync. Now what these are two kinds of ways of making different waveforms from these basic shapes. Now cross modulation, or frequency modulation, whatever you want to call it, is using the output of oscillator 2 to modulate the output of oscillator 1, which creates some quite dramatically strong and interesting tones. Oscillator sync over on VCO2 is another thing that's really quite tricky to describe and very easy to hear. Once you hear it and you know what it is, you'll be able to pick it out in a mix very easily. So what oscillator sync does is it forces oscillator 2 to restart its wave cycle at the same time as oscillator 1, regardless of the pitch of oscillator 2. It's kind of complex, but you'll be able to hear it, and that really is all that actually matters when you're programming the synthesizers. A sort of degree in physics is not actually that important. So how we're going to start this is I'm going to go over here to the VCO1, VCO2 mixer and roll us across so we're pointing to just VCO1, and this means we're going to hear just VCO1 for the time being, okay? So running through the controls, here we've got the range. Now as you can see, there's a little pop-up just appeared right of the mouse cursor currently, which is telling us that the coarse pitch of oscillator 1 is set to 8 foot. Switch it down to 16, up to 4 and 2. So where does this terminology come from, and what does it mean? Well, the terminology, this 16 foot, 8 foot, 4 foot, etc., is drawn from electric organs, which in turn drew it from physical pipe organs like you see in churches or cathedrals. The way a pipe organ works is quite simply, if you have a pipe that is 16 feet long to produce a particular pitch, let's say it's A, To produce an octave higher, you have a pipe that is 8 feet long, half the size. To produce another octave higher, you have a pipe that's 4 feet long. So what these basically are is octave selectors. And as you can see, there's no room between the choices. You simply jump up and down in whole octaves. If I hold down an oscillator, you'll hear what I mean. And there we go. Next is the waveform selector. Now the Jupiter 8 was equipped with some waves that don't always appear on analog synths, and so it's actually quite nicely spec'd. First up is the triangle wave here. Then we have sawtooth, the rectangle, which is also actually a pulse waveform which can be modulated over here by the PWM section, and lastly a full square. Now what we'll do is we'll run through the sound of each of those. Okay, so let's just take it up to the 8 footage. So there's the triangle, saw, the rectangle pulse, and the full square. Now to hear what's going on with the pulse wave, unlike the other sort of 3 waveforms available on VCO1, they're sort of static. They just produce that waveform. Now a pulse wave, over here we have a thing called PWM, and that stands for pulse width modulation. Now when it talks about the pulse width, let me just pull up a oscilloscope here and you'll see what I mean. Okay, a square wave is a pulse wave which is exactly 50%. So you can see there that the top half of the cycle of the wave and the lower half are exactly the same length. So there to there and there to there are the same, okay? Now if I move it on to the pulse waveform, you'll see we're going to get a different shape. Okay, so it currently looks like it's about 20 or 30% of the waveform is here, and then the rest is below the central line. Now what we can do with a pulse wave that we can't do with any others is we can change the shape of the wave. Now what you can do with this section, when it's set to M, this selector, it means that you can manually control the pulse width with this fader. Other options are to have that pulse width controlled by the LFO or an envelope. But so you can hear what I'm doing, I'm going to set it to manual, and then as I move this fader, you'll hear and see the shape of the waveform changing. Now you can see there where the pulse width is set down to 0, well, sorry, where the pulse width modulation is at 0, the modulation of the pulse, then what we actually have is a square wave. And it's only when we modulate that square wave's pulse width that we hear these different flavors of sound. So this wave selected here and this controller here give us access to quite a range of sounds, as well as the fact that we have the classic triangle, sawtooth, and the square, should we want it to be exactly just bang on a square, which doesn't get modulated. Now moving over to VCO2, we have again a control of pitch, the range function here. Now what's different about this range is that whereas on VCO1 everything is fixed between 16/8 and 4 and 2 footages, what we actually have here is the option to go semitones between the octaves. It's a continuously variable pitch control, okay? You can see it's rolling all the way around. So that gives us more flexibility of a pitch on VCO2 than it does VCO1. So for example, if we set both of them to 8, okay, so they are both pointing at 8 footage. Now what we need to do to hear VCO2, of course, is roll it round. So now we'll listen to VCO2. What I'm going to do actually is just put a mix 50-50, so we're hearing both VCOs at the same time. And if I now offset VCO2 up 7 semitones, then what we actually have is like a little one finger chord. Simple little trick. So the option to kind of control one of the ranges in individual steps gives us that straight away, and when we combine it with some of the other features like the cross modulation and the sync, it actually becomes a very simple but flexible control over pitch. Now, as well as the coarse controls, we also have a fine-tune control here, which lets me move the pitch of Oscillator 2 again slightly away from that of Oscillator 1, but this time instead of semitone steps we're talking about thousandths of a semitone. So if I move ever so slightly, you'll hear the 2. Create that kind of wonderful phasing sort of noise that you get, which is the sound of the two oscillators beating against each other, slightly out of phase because they're just not quite in the same pitch. It's very analog sound, for the want of a better word, because it's so hard to actually get two analog oscillators to lock absolutely, voltage controlled oscillators to lock to exactly the same pitch. So there's always some of this drift and movement going on. Now, the more I detune, the fine tune against VCO1, you'll hear that sort of drifting kind of modulation gets faster, and after a while we'll start hearing that actually the kind of two oscillators are so far out of tune we're actually going to get a properly detuned, slightly ugly sound. So it's really important before we kind of get too immersed in all the exotic possibilities that Jupiter 8 has to offer. But don't forget something as simple as just this pitch control, and this pitch control with a couple of sawtooths on them. Straight away you're into something with loads of potential and possibilities. So have a good play with kind of like one or two controls when you actually sort of get into grips with these synthesizers. So that's just simply control of pitch between the two oscillators. Now let's look at the waveforms on VCO2. We have sine wave, sawtooth, pulse, and white noise. One final pitch control before we move on is the norm low switch here on VCO2. Now what this does is it switches VCO2 from operating in the usual frequencies down to being rather like an LFO, really producing very deep tones. So instead of having this, switch it to low, very slow, long, deep tone there. And as with the norm setting, down the low setting, you can still sweep the pitch around. But as you can hear there, I'm playing different notes. Unlike the normal setting, it's not changing its pitch depending on what note I play. The pitch is fixed. Whereas if I switch it back to norm. So what's the use of an extra deep, almost inaudible oscillator that doesn't change pitch? Well, that is where we will find the cross modulation and this setting come into their own as a pairing. So let's look at the cross modulation now. If we swing this back so we're hearing just VCO1, what cross modulation does is it lets us hear VCO1 as usual, so. And then we feed the output of Oscillator 2 into Oscillator 1 as a modulation, which means that we get some very extreme, interesting sounds straight away. Let's have a play. So that was kind of interesting. So let's have a look at what we can do here. Let's take oscillator 2 different pitch and try bring it down here to say 8 and see what that comes up with. Some really abrasive sort of tones here straight away using a bit of cross modulation. Now these kind of sort of sounds aren't necessarily what you expect to conjure out of an nice old warm polite fat analog synth, but that's actually kind of where the beauty of the Jupiter comes through. It's kind of capable of doing all this kind of glossy, warm, smooth stuff. But when you actually start using the cross modulation, and again the oscillator sync, as we'll see in a second, it becomes quite a savage barking kind of synth. Just fiddling around there straight away with some great noises. So cross modulation simply feeds what's coming out of VCO2 into VCO1. Now, as you can see over here on our mixer between VCO1 and VCO2, we're not actually listening to what VCO2 is doing there. We're not hearing it in its own right. We're simply hearing the effect it's having on VCO1. You can, if you want to, layer the two in. They'll probably be slightly or massively out of tune. So you can hear there, we might have some really extreme sound going on through the cross modulation, but we can actually sort of slightly tame it by fading VCO2 back in. Just the raw oscillator that's being unaffected coming straight out, as well as the version that's being sent across to VCO1. And so you can get these kind of interesting tonalities and keep them in quite a musical sort of way. It's slightly raucous, I give you, but yeah, but that's the point. Basically, in my own experience of programming sounds, you want this sort of just aspect of slight wrongness in your sound sometimes, because this is what cuts through in mixes. This is why we hear certain sounds and want to sample them, because somewhere on the way they've picked up some grit or some mistake or just some ugliness. It's actually those sounds that make us kind of jump out and go, yeah, that's cool, what's that? So it's just this little sort of a trace of the cross modulated signal coming through. So that's the cross mod control. You simply control what the depth of the cross modulation is with this fader here. Let's just bring it again to here, just VCO1. So at the bottom here there's no cross modulation at all. We're just hearing VCO1 as it sounds. And the harder we press it, just wonderful noises, really ugly, and like you don't know how the hell you play a tune on them, but just simple little like repetitive little rhythmic riffs using something with that much character in it. It's going to add so much to your track. So that's the cross mod control. Now the other way of relating VCO1 and VCO2 is over here. It's called Oscillator Sync, which is on VCO2. Now, as I said earlier, what Oscillator Sync does is it forces VCO2 here. Each time VCO1 completes a wave, so you know there we have it doing a sawtooth. So each time it completes the sawtooth and sort of fires on the next repeat, whatever VCO2 is doing, it has to re-trigger its waveform. This is just best heard rather than me babbling about it, because it's quite sort of an easy effect to hear, and very, very distinctive. So we'll switch sync on. Okay, Oscillator 2 is now slaved to the pitch of Oscillator 1, regardless of what we do with this range here. If we're playing a D by sort of VCO1's tuning idea, VCO2, regardless of what we do with the pitch, has to try and produce a D. Now this will lead, as you'll hear in a second, to some quite strange and interesting modulations. So let's listen to VCO2 now. Okay, so we're hearing oscillator sync there with me kind of just moving the pitch around by hand. So let's just... Playing on a lower note, you might get some of the tonality. Get some nice rich tones there, and you can hear they're all still playing this D, even while I'm sweeping the semitone selector of VCO2 here around. It keeps playing D, but we keep getting sort of different wave shapes and different tones. Now the best way to hear oscillator sync in action, to be honest, is when you sweep one of the oscillators against the other. Now we're not looking at the envelopes and the LFOs yet, so we'll come back to this, but I'm just going to sneak ahead for a second so you can hear what the effect we're after is. So if I just stick this VCO modulator to effect just VCO1, we're going to use envelope 1 as the source with a long decay down to 0 sustain. Okay, now if I say yes, envelope 1, please sweep VCO1, we should hear a kind of big long oscillator sync sweep. Okay, so that's one kind of os sound. Then if I actually sweep VCO2 this time, you'll hear an even more pronounced version. Okay, that's like a classic oscillator sync sweep there. It's often described as being slightly like an electric guitar, the sort of very harmonic sound, like a distorted electric guitar. Whatever it is, it's definitely oscillator sync. Once you sort of know this noise and kind of understand what the kind of tonality it produces are, you'll know when to reach for it. So it's a thing to sort of sit, turn it on, and just play with these intervals between VCO1 and VCO2, and find out what kind of tones you can pull out. Now, one of my favourite things to do with cross-mod is to send white noise from VCO2 over into VCO1. Now, if we just listen to VCO2 on its own, we're going to hear it's just white noise. Regardless of what note we play on, of course, it has no pitch, it's just that tone of all the frequencies blurring away. Now, what we do if we cross-modulate VCO1 with the white noise is we introduce a completely random fluctuating noise modulation into the pitch and tone of VCO1. What this basically does is gives it like a tuned noise, which is, some of you old Daft Punk fans may recognise. It's a particular sort of favourite sound amongst that kind of LCD sound system, Tiga, Daft Punk kind of people. So let's roll this across to VCO1, and you should now hear... I bring that cross mod back to say halfway. So fantastic abrasive but nonetheless tuned pitched sound. And how much of that kind of aggression and fizz you want is just down to the cross mod. Used very gently, it's great for making like sort of just slightly kind of dusty, ambienty sort of pad noises. So yeah, lovely thing. I mean, this is what I was saying before about the Jupiter 8, is it's really easy to overlook one of these combinations that this tiny little section offers you, like feeding the white noise through the cross mod from VCO2 into VCO1, opens up like a whole sort of sound to this synthesizer, but it's not particularly highlighted, it's not rammed in your face, it just happens to be that if you spend some time fiddling with these controls and just keep seeing what the combinations of waveforms, pitches, bit of cross mod, bit of oscillator sync, pulse width modulation to keep that sort of wave shifting around if that's the kind of thing you're after. There is a wealth of possibilities here, really is. So get to grips with this. Next thing we'll do is we'll look at the filters next. See you in a minute.